The former Conservative Party leader took aim at staunch Remainers Philip Hammond and Mr. Grieve, mocking them for going into a furious spin because they are panicking at the possibility of Boris Johnson striking a deal with the European Union. He accused the pair and their cohorts of seemingly starting to hatch a last-ditch plan to force the UK to remain in the EU beyond the 31st of October. Writing for the Daily Telegraph, Mr. Duncan Smith claimed we shouldn't be surprised at their changing positions over Brexit as they both have form. He said, not long ago, rebel Remainers in the Tory party swore faithfully that they voted for the Ben Surrender Act because they wanted to ensure Boris Johnson got a deal. I can recall vividly in the House of Commons how they all nodded sagely when Oliver Letwin stated that this was their only goal. Yet within just a few weeks, many of those nodding heads now seem to be shaking heads. Philip Hammond, Dominic Grieve and their cohorts, panicking at the possibility that Boris Johnson may actually now get a deal, have seemingly started hatching a plot to force the UK to stay in the EU beyond the 31st of October. We shouldn't be surprised. After all, so many of these complainants have form when it comes to changing their position on the issue of Brexit. After Britain voted to leave, they vowed to uphold the result and decried a second referendum. Grieve himself said in 2016 that, if you invoke Article 50 it is a one-way street to exit, with no agreement, if necessary. Yet now it seems these and other pledges are to be trashed. As well as abandoning democratic commitments, many have even taken to casually abandoning their previous political views. Mr. Duncan Smith said free trade is a cornerstone of Conservative policy, but lashed out at former Chancellor Mr. Hammond, accusing him of last week criticizing the theory Britain would be able to increase its gross domestic product (GDP) significantly by signing trade deals around the world. He claimed Mr. Hammond is drawing on a very flawed Treasury forecast produced whilst he was Chancellor, one which ignored international evidence to the contrary and used very negative assumptions on migration, and even more brazenly referred to unspecified implementation difficulties. The former Conservative leader added the research concluded the positive impacts of any non-EU trade deals agreed after striking a Brexit deal with the EU would be minimal, adding such a ridiculous assessment flies in the face of basic global economic history. Mr. Duncan Smith raged, the former Chancellor's puzzling attitude to free trade lends a worrying insight into the political psyche of so many avid Remainers. One wonders whether over time they have become so corroded by their anger at Brexit that they are determined to see no benefit whatsoever in striking a deal of any kind. Even some of his fellow Conservative rebels are concerned by this extremism. One who rebelled on the Surrender Act but who, like many rebels wants to support a deal, has described the former Chancellor as totally paranoid. He then launched a separate stinging attack against former Attorney General and arch-Remained Mr. Grieve, who the former Tory leader raged has been central in forcing through very significant legislation in constitutional smash and grabs, allowing MPs less than one day to examine the details. Mr. Duncan Smith said, now the PM hopes to bring a deal before us and get the bill through quickly. His attitude has changed. Mr. Grieve claims it would be wrong to force through such important constitutional legislation in 7 days. He has declared it improper, unaware of the irony. Brexiteers need to brace themselves, but in a furious attack against both Remainers, Mr. Duncan Smith accused them of forming part of a die-hard Tory rebel clique that could give Commons Speaker John Bercow the power to send a letter to Brussels asking for a Brexit delay, or even appoint him PM in a constitutional coup by voting down the Queen's speech. He said, Mr. Hammond and Mr. Grieve appear to form part of a die-hard Tory rebel clique. It may be plotting to give Speaker John Bercow the power to send an extension letter to Brussels, or even appoint him PM in a constitutional coup by voting down the Queen's speech. These hardcore Remainers simply want to stop Brexit and defy the will of the people by any device, whether that be by revoking the referendum result, having a second referendum or taking over government. Mr. Duncan Smith concluded, evidently, this group allied with such saboteurs as Lib Dems, Scots Nats and astonishingly Jeremy Corbyn are determined to break Brexit whatever the cost. But their days of subterfuge are over, and at last their anti-democratic agenda is now exposed to the British public.